Want me to get started, and I'm good to go.
Okay, wonderful. So it's 1:25. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining DataCon LA 2021, and welcome to the Data for Good track. My name is Joanna Perdomo, and I'm your host. And our co-host today is Minroy Das, and we're going to be moderating the chat and Q&A during this session. And today we have our guest Monark, and he's going to be talking about exposing human trafficking networks with AI. So Monark is a managing director with Accenture's Applied Intelligence Strategy based out of San Francisco. He brings over 17 years of experience in the areas of analytics and responsible AI. He's passionate about driving adoption and scale for unique AI-led transformations. Monark is the co-steer for Accenture's Global Human Trafficking Center of Practice and has helped shape the narrative on the holistic approach to combat human trafficking. Monark is a thought leader and a public speaker who has presented various points of views on leading practices. And I won't take any more of his time. Thank you for being with us, Monark.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joanna. I would almost say when somebody else introduces you, you kind of feel a little bit shy and embarrassed. So thank you for doing such a great job at introducing me. Let me first take the opportunity to thank Subhash, Joanna, you, and the entire DataCon LA team to really put together this amazing event. We're very excited. Some of these sessions have been brilliant, and I'm hoping we'll be able to continue this trend with this particular presentation as well. Now, the topic that we have at hand is a very grim one, to be honest. This is truly speaking to the world that we would typically not live in. This is the world of what we see going on and around us in the space of human trafficking. And before I actually move into explaining how data, how applied intelligence, how artificial intelligence, all the new sophisticated techniques are helping support disruption of this egregious crime, I wanted to at least set the stage in terms of what human trafficking is all about, right? What does it mean? And hence, I wanted to start with the definition of human trafficking. And the definition of human trafficking is very simply put by some of the leading agencies in the world, like United Nations, ILO. It is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, or receipt of people, and especially by threat, force, coercion, deception, to essentially benefit somebody else, right? It is essentially aimed at taking away somebody's dignity and and abusing the freedom of an individual to essentially make them force them almost into activities that they're not willing to partake in. Now, broadly, there are two big aspects of human trafficking, and I think, as you see, a lot of what we are going to cover is one half of it, which is sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is one of the major problems of our modern day society. This is when a lot of the victims are groomed into the particular business to essentially provide sexual favors for different types of demand owners, right? It could be people in the porn industry, people in the massage parlor industry. We'll touch upon a little bit of that. And then the other half of human trafficking is labor trafficking, right? This is all about slavery. This is all about forced labor. And one of the interesting pieces is labor trafficking, human trafficking, sex trafficking overall is an extremely profitable business. This is the thing that really gets to my nerves, which is human trafficking is not just a crime; it is a business, and it is an extremely profitable business. One of the things I want to very quickly highlight you to is what are some of these numbers that make human trafficking such a massive business and something that is so entrenched into our society. You'd be very surprised to know that human trafficking essentially became the second most profitable crime globally a few years back. Obviously, the only other trade and only the crime that essentially is more profitable than human trafficking is drug trade. But it was weapons trade that human trafficking actually overtook to become the second most profitable crime globally. Now, if you think about it from the pure numbers perspective, there are multiple reports that will tell you that anywhere between 25 million plus victims are currently enslaved around the world. Some reports will peg that number to as high as 40 to 50 million. And that is simply because this is such a tabooed subject, it is extremely underreported. A lot of people do not talk about sex trafficking, a lot of people do not talk about forced labor. And this, as you can see, right, because of the underreporting, this number could be as high as anywhere between 45 to 50 million people. Just to give you a perspective, this is bigger than the size of all of Switzerland, right? So think about it, that there are more people currently enslaved around the world than the entire population of Switzerland, or in fact, a lot of other countries in the world. Human trafficking overall is also a $140 billion industry. So this is, as I said, right, not just a crime; it is a business, and this is a very profitable business. And while some of these upfront numbers are staggering, so while some of these upfront numbers are eye-popping, the sad state of affairs is essentially the bottom line of the numbers, and that is how many prosecutions, how many convictions, how many victims have we identified. And the numbers that you see here are typically the kind of numbers that get reported per year, of what we are able to prosecute, how many cases are we able to prosecute, how many convictions are we able to get, and how many victims are we able to identify and rescue from these services. And as you can see, while there are 45.8 million victims enslaved in the world, only about 85,000 of them get identified on an annual basis. This is roughly less than half of 1%, right? And this is the technology divide that we truly are talking about. This is not just about getting to one person here and there. This is truly about how do we bridge this gap between the perpetrators and the predators, who are moving drastically ahead of our agencies, of every one of us, and creating this technology divide, creating this data divide, that is just currently unfathomable to really bridge. So, having established what human trafficking is all about, having established some of these numbers, one of my personal serendipitous moment came through when we were meeting an investigator from a state bureau. And while we were discussing a lot of the issues, while we were discussing a lot of the problems that we could potentially uncover and then hopefully solve using some of the technology solutions we had, he made a statement which has stuck with me. And this is verbatim what he said. He said, while the perpetrators move at the speed of light, we unfortunately move at the speed of government. And that is a lot to do with how fast are perpetrators really using some of the cutting edge technologies. They are using encrypted phones, they are using deep web and dark web forums, they are utilizing messaging services that are not necessarily easy to track and monitor. They are using digital footprints. You would be very surprised to know that some of the biggest social media platforms that you know about are the biggest recruitment and grooming platforms for human trafficking as well. They are also some of the biggest brokering and advertising platforms for human trafficking. And this is where a lot of our agencies, a lot of our public sector, a lot of our law enforcement fall short, because they are still antiquated in terms of the use of technology. The government is still trying to figure out the best approach to really work through multiple jurisdictions, multiple data silos that they currently have, and that's where we can help. So that's predominantly been our focus. Now, when you talk about the human trafficking, obviously, we as Accenture are pretty much in our sweet spot is the middle layer that you see there. It's the disruption. It is how do we bring technology to the human ingenuity to really disrupt this human trafficking kill chain. But before I speak to the disruption, and I think I promise you the majority of this particular talk is about the technology disruption. I wanted to inform this particular group, and thank you for all the people who've decided to partake in this particular talk, because it is very important to understand that human trafficking is not just about creating disruptions to the existing operations. It is also about creating awareness. A lot of people don't talk about human trafficking. A lot of people don't even know how to spot human trafficking. Just to let you know, and I have to put my hand up and say, 3 years back, if you would have asked me about human trafficking, I would have said it is either a developing country problem, or it is a poor background problem, or it is associated to abusive childhood and or families. My perception over the last 3 years have changed drastically. human trafficking happens every single place. It happens as much in developed countries as it does in developing countries. It happens as much in rich and well-to-do families as it does with poor and underprivileged families. It does happen in and around our streets. It happens in and around the same airports that we commute from. It happens at the same hotels that we go and stay. And that was an eye-opening um, uh, understanding when I actually came to know how prevalent the space of human trafficking is. And I think the number one thing that we focus on, at least the upfront thing that we focus on, is to create awareness, is to make sure that people can talk about human trafficking, is to make sure that people understand what human trafficking is all about. And potentially, hopefully, we can potentially get all the people to teach them how to spot and report human trafficking if it happens in front of you. So that's what we've been focusing on heavily as well. Obviously, we'll speak to some of the disruption angles and how we have been able to bring technology. But the one piece before I move to that, I want to focus on is the final component, which is restoration. And you'd be very surprised to know that there are sections of our society where 70 to 80% of the survivors who are rescued from the business are re-victimized. 70 to 80% of them land up back into the business after having been rescued, simply because they do not have a dignified way of social and financial independence in our world, right? They've already coming back from being abused. They potentially, the control that the predators and the perpetrators have on them is enormous. And without any societal support in terms of financial independence, in terms of shelters, in terms of jobs, they struggle. And a lot of them actually go back. And this is something that we as a society truly have to be responsible for. We have to truly focus that we keep a survivor first approach. We focus on restoration and healing as much as we do on awareness and disruption. And that's truly when the human trafficking solutions truly can come a 360 degrees, right? It is not just about identifying victims and rescuing them, but it is making sure that they can have a dignified life after. So with that, let me focus then on the disruption part of it, which is essentially been one of our primary areas of focus. Now, interestingly, you wouldn't associate human trafficking to or sex trafficking to a technology issue, ideally, right? Or typically, you would typically think it's a policy issue. It is investigative. There's a lot of human angle associated to it, which obviously there are. But the thing that works for us is, or actually two things that work for us in this particular space, is that human trafficking, the way we see it, is a supply chain, right? And think about it in this sense, right? Like in a supply chain, you have a demand. Sex trafficking has a demand. In countries like United States, these demands surface as porn industries, massage parlor businesses. To fulfill this particular demand, you need supply. And for supply, you essentially have grooming and recruitment of our victims, both in physical premises as well as in our digital footprints. And then to essentially bring the supply to the demand, you have everything in between, which is the business operation side of it. So you essentially have to have transportation, you have hospitality because they need to stay somewhere. You essentially need financial transactions because there is exchange of money. You essentially need business facades that can actually run as prostitution rings. So you need operations. All of that means there is enough digital footprint in this entire supply chain that we can exploit. As I said, a lot of these, as you can think about, right, there are social media platforms, there are messaging services, there are airline ticket reservations, there are online hotel bookings, there are massage business license information and online reviews that happen. And these are some of the digital footprint that we are able to tap into to ultimately identify human trafficking activity and potentially be a lot more proactive. So if you see this particular picture, this really talks about the human trafficking kill chain as we speak about, right? The supply side of the house is recruitment and grooming. We have solutions in this particular space where we've created neural network based solutions that determine child predators in a chat room in real time. So most often than not, in a chat, especially the digital chat rooms, There are multiple players who are essentially trying to groom a victim. These are mostly vulnerable sections of our society. It could be children, it could be women, it could be immigrants. And then the style during recruitment is not as abrasive as you would typically see during the operations. So you would see a lot of coercion techniques, a lot of making sure that they are able to gain their trust. And this is different type of play in which there are multiple predators that try to groom a specific victim into coercion into the business, right? So we've essentially been able to identify some very solid leads based on just real-time tracking, based on a neural network-based solution that helps identify these predatory behaviors. In the business operations space, we have Artemis, and the reason it is color coded in a different way is we are going to speak a little bit in more detail about it. But Artemis is essentially a solution that we co-created with another nonprofit called as the Global Emancipation Network. A big shout out to Sherry Caltagirone, who is the executive founder for this particular nonprofit. But when we came together, we were looking at massage businesses as one of the business facade for running prostitution rings. You will see some of the statistics in the subsequent slides, but this is a very prevalent and a pervasive industry in the United States alone, and broadly across all of the other countries as well. And some of them partake into illicit services. A lot of them that partake into illicit services actually employ human trafficking victims. And we were essentially trying to understand if there are enough digital footprint available for us to risk classify these massage businesses based on their activity levels, and we are able to prioritize the investigative businesses for our agencies. You obviously have brokering, which is the demand side of the house. This is where the advertisements typically follow. This is where we have a solution that can look at advertisements, the pictures that are being socialized, and identify if there are any human trafficking victims potentially being brokered here. And then we also have the human rights due diligence work, where we essentially partner to understand with large infrastructure companies, with large project companies, what is the impact of large scale projects on the local environments in multiple areas, including sustainability, including human trafficking, both in terms of sex trafficking, forced labor, so on and so forth. So we kind of create this report, which is predominantly used as a precursor approval before large infrastructure projects can be approved for some of the companies that we work for. So that's been a little bit of the overall solutioning and how we've seen this particular space evolve. What I now want to focus on is Artemis, and I briefly touched upon this, but this is the report from Polaris. This is about 2 years back, so I'm sure the numbers have updated and they're potentially bigger. But this particular report from Polaris very clearly highlights that illicit massage services business is a massive industry in its own. It is roughly a $2.5 billion industry in the United States alone. There are upwards of 9,000 illicit massage businesses that currently operate in the United States. And it is not surprising that most of these operate close to immigrant population, close to ports and busy airports. And that's why if you see the heat map, it is not surprising that states like California, states like Florida, states like New York, states like Texas are very heavily impacted by this. Now, when we started our solution, we had three things in mind. The problems that we were trying to solve for was, one, the entire approach to the investigative processes in this particular space was extremely reactive. Now, what do you mean by reactive? Human trafficking investigations, especially the sex trafficking investigations, typically wait for tip-offs. The tip-off could come from parents, it could come from group homes, it could come from hotels, it could come from a lot of other places, right? But essentially, they're waiting for a tip-off before they can start investigating, or they're essentially waiting for a victim recovery. The victim recovery could be based on a raid that has been conducted on a street. It can be a raid that has been conducted on a hotel. But you are essentially waiting for either a victim recovery or a tip-off before the investigations truly take place. Once you do have a lead, the entire process itself is extremely labor intensive. Sometimes the information is not in a single place. Sometimes just getting evidences to even predicate a specific case is so long that the people have moved on. The case has essentially moved across jurisdictions. And then obviously associated to that is a whole mental tax issue that nobody typically speaks about. when you are responsible for dealing with the space of sex trafficking, you are dealing with some of the crassest language, some of the goriest pictures, some of the most perverted minds in the industry, in the society, and it is important to talk about mental health for our investigators, our analysts, our nonprofit partners who typically work in this particular space day in day out. So those were the problems that we were trying to solve for, and hence Artemis was created as a potential solution that can be automated and proactive. So instead of waiting for a tip off, can we look at the digital footprint already available and automatically and proactively tell you that these are some of the places where human trafficking may be currently happening? Can we prioritize? Right, prioritization is big. Most of our agencies, most of our partners that we work with are trying to do more and more with less resources. We are talking about money being a constraint. We are talking about people being constrained. We are talking about bandwidth constraints. We are talking about challenges across just coordination between different agencies. And one of the things that we always understand is the best way to do more with less is create a prioritization matrix, right? If there were 30,000 massage businesses today in the California state, how do I know which ones to go after? And that's what we were trying to do from a prioritization standpoint. We obviously want to mitigate the risk for our partners, assist them. This is not about removing any human intelligence. This is essentially aiding and complementing the human intelligence with machine learning, with artificial intelligence, and make them a lot more productive and efficient. And then the entire thing had to be extremely transparent and scalable, right? We couldn't have created this as a black box. This cannot be a solution which ultimately points a finger but does not tell you why. So we had to make sure that this entire solution was extremely transparent and scalable. And to that extent, these are the final couple of slides that I have. One which talks to you, what does the Artemis digital footprint look like, and what were the kind of data that we were collecting? And if you see, we have two halves of this particular data. The left-hand side of what you see on the screen in the pink boxes are essentially some of the data that's available in the open web data forums. These are data that you can collect from massage businesses, license information. There are massage therapist information. There are massage schools data. The interesting part is there's also a lot of adverse filings that are available on police websites, PDs, attorney general's websites, etc. And these adverse filings could be anything from license suspension to arrest to prior convictions. And we are able to take some of those into accounts to understand the history of the business, the owners, the masseuse into our risk classification model. But the very interesting part of this particular project was also the right hand side of the picture, which is Yelp and RubMap reviews. Now, all of you know Yelp, but RubMap was a very interesting data source for us. RubMap is a deep web forum. So essentially, you and I cannot go and scrape off data, or it's not accessible for anybody to go and get the data off it. It is a deep web forum in the sense that you need a verified, certified, with social security number, credit card number, essentially an approved persona before you can do anything with it. And RubMap is Yelp for illicit services, right? It is almost a place where a lot of people go and provide reviews as to which massage business did they visit, which masseuse did they take services from, what type of services did they get, what type of payments did they make, what is the best time, etc., etc. And this is the place where we are able to look into the reviews and analyze them using some of the most sophisticated natural language processing techniques to very contextualize what those reviews mean and whether they are pointing and hinting towards a human trafficking victim being providing the services there. Just to give you a classic example, the term fresh is such a dichotomous a term in this particular industry. You could very easily say, I feel fresh after a massage, which is an extremely legit way of writing or using fresh in a perfectly legit massage that you may have received. Or fresh is also used to represent an underage victim in this particular business. So you could very easily have used the term fresh as a fresh piece of meat available for service. And that essentially points to an underage victim that has just entered this particular massage business to offer services. And that kind of context is what we were trying to infuse as part of our natural language processing techniques and intelligence that we were generating out of it. And when we had this analysis from the reviews, we would combine it with the rest of the information and come up with the risk classification. And the risk classification was very simple. It was essentially a score between 0 to 1, where 1 represented high risk establishments that we believe, based on their digital footprint, are very heavily involved in human trafficking. If you are 0 or closer to 0, it essentially means you are potentially safe, at least from a digital footprint perspective, on just illicit services and human trafficking services. And as you can see, this particular picture, for the state of Florida, for which we actually kickstarted the pilot for, there are roughly about 22,700 massage businesses. MBs in here stand for massage businesses. We, for our pilot, analyzed 3,500 of them. And we were able to very successfully prioritize the top 13%, 10 to 13%, which is 465 massage businesses, which actually received a score of 1. And that almost meant that based on the digital footprint, we almost guarantee that there is some illicit services going on there, and very high likelihood that there is human trafficking services currently being, or human trafficking victims being employed there. And those are the kind of work that we ended up doing. This is some work that we are now trying to rinse and repeat as part of all the different state and federal, as well as city level work that we end up doing. This is, as I said, one of the more fulfilling projects that we've had, simply because this is truly creating a people, public, private partnership that is extremely needed to tackle this egregious crime in our modern society. Um, so I'm hoping this is something that has at least enlightened you to the problem of human trafficking, how you could typically help, going back to that awareness and restoration services too. But then, how can technology help bridge some of the digital divide between the perpetrators and our agencies? So, thank you so much, Joanna. This is the end of my presentation. So happy to answer any questions if there are any queries, clarifications. I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you, Monark. If folks have questions, if you could please type them into the Q&A. And so Brian Blackwell says, thank you for a great presentation for constructing your outcome variables. They primarily seem like proxies. Were you able to obtain any ground truth data on trafficking convictions?
We actually have had successful convictions as a part of the insights that we developed through this one. In fact, in the state of California itself, we have had 3 massage businesses that we were able to shut down, working along with investigators based on the insights that we had generated out of it. Think about it this way, right? Our solution is not meant to be a conviction engine. It's not a prosecutorial engine. It is more a predicate engine. So what it essentially helps you do is it allows you to create that upfront search warrants, upfront investigative cases, so that the humans can then, the human intelligence, the field force can go and investigate it further on the back of the data that we've collected, and then ultimately use that as evidence as well, right? So this is not a prosecutorial engine. This is, you're right in the sense that they are at the very upfront part of the investigations, but we have been able to successfully use this solution to ultimately reach convictions and have successfully, very proudly so, shut down a few massage businesses as a part of this as well, in the state of California alone.
Are there any more questions from the audience?
One of the things I'd like to mention here, Joanna, is how can people help, right? A lot of people that look at this particular issue uh, understand the kind of gravity of the issue and the crime that we are dealing with here, but it also is sometimes not very evident in terms of how an individual can support. And I think I want to make sure, while all of us are technologists, all of us can play in that disruption area. I would highly recommend that you, and I'm happy to reach offline as well. If you reach out to me, I'll be happy to answer that. But in the awareness piece, I'd hope that a lot of people can actually take a step up and just learn what it means to have human trafficking going on in and around you. As I said, this is not restricted to a specific class, section, region, gender at all, right? I mean, this is pervasive. And if you can just be a little bit more aware, keep your eyes and ears open, that would be great. And then there are a lot of nonprofit partners that currently support a lot of restoration and healing. In fact, in the SoCal region itself, we've actually worked with Safe House. We have worked with some nonprofits like Refuge for Women. We have been working with other nonprofits like Collective Liberty. There are a lot of other nonprofits that we typically get associated with who work in this particular space, not just to create technology disruptions, but also provide shelters, also provide awareness trainings. And it would be good if you can find a cause that you associate with and get involved. So happy to take any other offline recommendations, but this is just a call out from my end on how people can get involved.
Yeah, and sort of similar to that, Akiva asks, are there government collaborations, grants, or ways to share data?
I would say not as much as what we would have liked. Everyone is attempting to get there. Obviously, people recognize that the way to fight the modern day crime is to essentially get technology and data involved, right? As I said, digital footprint is just at the forefront of all of these operations as it happens, right? And there are government agencies that are taking a step. There are a lot of states and federal agencies and local city who've actually started creating task force. There exists a task force for human trafficking in the state of California as well. And I think most of them are trying to get a lot more collaborative. Obviously, the true collaborative partnership will be there when public and private partnerships can come together. Currently, obviously, a lot of private companies, the social media platforms, etc., do share information with open investigations. But I'm sure we can do a lot more. If you're not aware, I would highly recommend that you look up something called as NECMEC. NECMEC is typically the national stands for National Commission for Missing and Exploited Children, and that is that along with Polaris run our national hotlines, and you can potentially individually provide a lot of cyber tips as if you see any cyber abuse happening online. So yes, there are collaborations, but I'm sure we can do a lot better than where we are right now.
And Kirti asks, how much of the intelligence would require human intervention, or are we able to successfully use the model completely?
So I think I touched upon very briefly on this. This particular system is not a prosecutorial engine, right? So it's not as if something comes out of this particular system or module and you are able to now create an arrest warrant against a massage business or an owner or somebody, right? So the idea is to use this as a predicate engine. This is definitely almost all of the cases that come out of it require a human intervention, simply because this is supposed to augment humans, not necessarily eliminate the human intelligence, right? So this is very collaborative. This is working with the investigators and the analysts on the field and providing them, as I said, prioritization, a proactive approach, and an efficiency that is associated with the entire use of AI.
And it looks like we have one final question. So how have you been conceptualizing fairness and equity issues? For example, are there equity issues if businesses or individuals are falsely identified as being involved in human trafficking?
So that is an extremely good statement, right? Both in terms of one, it starts with, so think about it both ways, right? One, there are victims, and then the others are perpetrators, and in either one of them, you run a risk of essentially creating some sort of a bias. It is quite possible that you could have false positives. It is quite possible, generally in the space of sex trafficking itself, in the victim space, a lot of people equate victims as women. But you'll be very surprised to know that, and you shouldn't be surprised to know actually, that in this particular space of sex trafficking, it's not just the women. There are boys, there are men, there are LGBTQ communities who are essentially victimized as well. And if you really ask me, and we have been actually doing a couple of sessions with LGBTQI, which is an institute that supports awareness in this particular space. We are getting into a situation where the LGBTQ community, for instance, faces dual taboos, right? They are essentially trying to come off a sex trafficking world, but they're also dealing with their own challenges of being accepted as an LGBTQ community member. And that particular thing is tougher on them. And one of the things we want to make sure is when we look at the problem statement, we are not just aiming at a specific gender. We are essentially making sure that this is equitable in its analysis across the board. Similarly for perpetrators, and this is the interesting part, right? As I keep saying this, because this is not a prosecutorial engine, this is essentially not pinpointing anybody in the public space without necessarily the human intervention and the evidences before we can say aye or nay, right? So this is truly based on digital footprint. We do not try to analyze demographic information of license owners or masseuse or so on and so forth, right? So we are typically looking at, as you can see from the data, things that don't necessarily point towards a specific gender, race, any affiliations to that extent. This is mostly reviews. This is mostly prior convictions, etc. So we try to make sure that the input data is devoid of as much bias as we can. And then, as I said, right, this is not ultimately convicting somebody versus the other. This is truly a risk classification engine, and like any risk classification engine, and as you can show from the scores of 0 to 1, it's a probability, right? All it says is that if you're closer to 1, you're higher probable to be that particular uh, establishment that is potentially using human trafficking victims, and that is also purely based on the digital footprint that you have. So there could be malicious events where there could be bad actors who can essentially try to malign a specific business by trying to post some fake reviews. It's quite possible. And by making sure that this is not a standalone system but a human plus machine intelligence, we try to avoid as much of that bias as possible.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation, Monark, and for everyone and your wonderful questions. We have a few minutes. I don't know if, Monark, you have one final comment or thing you want to leave the audience with, and then we'll close off this session.
Yeah, no, I think the one thing that I mentioned right at the start, right, which is the thing that really hit it out for me about 3 years back when I really got engaged in this, is to understand that human trafficking is not somebody else's problem. Human trafficking is a problem that all of us have possibly been exposed to. It's just that we didn't realize and we didn't recognize it. This happens in and around us, especially for cities like LA, especially for cities which are busy, airports, ports, a lot of people coming in and out, a lot of immigrant populations. We are potentially sitting at some of the hotbeds of human trafficking in the United States alone. And just making yourself aware and open to this issue will help a lot of people. There's a lot of ways we can help. So please do not undercut this particular issue as somebody else's problem or somewhere else problem. This is happening in and around us. And I hope that even if a few of you actually believe in what you just saw and can potentially participate, that would make a huge difference. This is an extremely egregious crime, as I keep repeating it. This is something that attacks a person's dignity right at that core level. And it is important for us as a society to really step up. Forget Accenture, forget the specific city or whatever, right? It is on us as a society to really come together and support the victims, the survivors. And that can only start with the survivor first approach, right? We should not be victimizing the survivors, right? We should not be attacking the survivors. They are essentially the victims here and not the perpetrators. So let's keep that in mind, and let's keep an open mind. And if even a few of you think this was relevant and can step up in terms of awareness, in terms of being involved, I would consider this a highly successful talk.
Thank you once again, Monark. And thank you to the audience. You can contact the speaker directly if there are any further questions. There's also copies of the slides that are available. And please just provide any feedback using the form in the chat box. We'll drop that in momentarily. And thank you all for being a part of ZetaCon LA this year. Enjoy the rest of the talks.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.